They told us it was impossible, that one lobby could never fall, that its grip on politics, media, and global power was too strong to break. But today, we're seeing the cracks, deep, undeniable, irreversible. For decades, the Israel lobby shaped what we saw, what we believed, and what we were allowed to say. But the silence is breaking, and the world is finally waking up. In this powerful journey, we're not just going to talk about politics. We're going to uncover the truth behind a system that silenced millions and how it's all started to collapse. You'll learn why students are rising, why social media has become the new battlefield, and why global power is shifting in ways that will reshape history. This isn't just a fall, it's a beginning. Stay with me till the end, because what you'll hear today isn't just information, it's a call to courage. A reminder that no matter how powerful the lie, the truth always finds a way to rise. Let's begin. The Israel lobby has long benefited from firm bipartisan support within the United States, standing as one of the most influential foreign policy lobbies in Washington. For decades, both Republicans and Democrats have largely walked in lockstep when it comes to supporting Israeli interests, often framing it as an unshakable alliance rooted in shared democratic values. However, this foundation is beginning to crack. A generational and ideological shift is taking place in American politics. Younger voters, especially millennials and Gen Z, are far less inclined to accept the traditional pro-Israel narrative without question. They are more informed, more globally connected, and more skeptical of foreign policy decisions that seem inconsistent with human rights. This change in sentiment is particularly visible among progressive Democrats, many of whom now openly challenge Israel's treatment of Palestinians, military aggression, and settlement policies. Prominent lawmakers, such as those from the so-called Squad, have broken long-standing taboos by directly criticizing the Israeli government and calling for conditions on U.S. aid. These once marginal views are gaining traction and entering mainstream discourse. At the same time, the Republican Party's support for Israel has taken on a different flavor. While their backing remains robust, it is increasingly tied to religious motivations and political polarization rather than strategic diplomacy. This shift has created a situation where support for Israel is no longer viewed as a unifying issue, but rather as a partisan wedge. The consequence of this is significant. When a lobby loses bipartisan support, its influence becomes vulnerable to electoral changes. If a growing segment of one party's base no longer supports unconditional aid or blind political backing, then policies begin to change, even if slowly. This erosion of support is not only visible in polling data, but also in the tone of debates, the content of media coverage, and the priorities of advocacy groups. The once dominant narrative that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic is no longer as effective at silencing dissent. People are distinguishing between criticizing a government and hating a people, and that distinction is weakening the emotional and political power that the Israel lobby used to command. As a result, what was once considered political suicide to speak out against the Israel lobby is now becoming a badge of moral courage for a growing number of leaders and activists. Social media has emerged as a powerful force, capable of challenging traditional narratives, and its impact on the Israel-Palestine discourse has been profound. For decades, mainstream media served as the primary source of information for the public, and the Israel lobby maintained significant influence over how events were portrayed, often shaping a one-sided narrative that favored Israeli perspectives. However, the rise of platforms like Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube has created a new battleground where control of the narrative is no longer centralized. Instead of polished press releases or filtered reports, raw footage from the ground in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem is now being broadcast directly to global audiences. Ordinary people with smartphones have become journalists, and their first-hand accounts have triggered emotional responses that polished media coverage rarely could. This unfiltered exposure has deeply affected public perception, particularly among younger generations who no longer rely on legacy outlets to form their opinions. The shift has weakened the Israel lobby's ability to dominate the conversation. Viral videos showing bombings, arrests, and civilian casualties have sparked international outrage and mobilized movements that once struggled to find visibility. Hashtags like Free Palestine trend globally within minutes of major incidents, often bypassing traditional media gatekeeping entirely. This rapid dissemination of information has also empowered digital activists and influencers who use their platforms to educate, fundraise, and organize protests on a global scale. The visual power of social media undermines attempts to sanitize or control the narrative, especially when graphic evidence contradicts official statements. The lobby's PR strategies, once effective in shaping sympathy and moral high ground, are increasingly being met with skepticism and fact-checking in real time. Moreover, algorithms reward engagement, and emotionally charged content, especially involving injustice, spreads faster than official statements or policy analysis. As more people become aware of the disparity in power and suffering, support for Palestine grows. While the image of Israel as a perpetual victim weakens, this trend is not temporary. It reflects a deep transformation in how people consume and assess information. The gatekeepers of perception have lost their monopoly. The Israel lobby, long accustomed to working behind the scenes in elite political and media circles, is now facing a force it cannot fully control. The voice of the global public, amplified by technology and driven by conscience, academic institutions, cultural influencers, and youth-led movements, are increasingly becoming centers of resistance against the traditional dominance of the Israel lobby. Universities, once cautious about addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are now vibrant spaces of activism, debate, and mobilization. Students are organizing walkouts, hosting teach-ins, and passing resolutions that call for divestment from companies complicit in Israeli occupation or military aggression. These actions are not limited to fringe groups. They're being led by mainstream student bodies and supported by faculty members across disciplines. The once taboo topic of criticizing Israel's policies is now openly discussed in classrooms and lecture halls, and efforts to silence or penalize dissenting voices are often met with even greater backlash. This academic awakening is not happening in isolation. It reflects a broader societal shift where younger generations demand ethical consistency in global affairs. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers are also contributing to the erosion of the Israel lobby's cultural stronghold. Prominent cultural figures have spoken out or refused to perform in Israel as part of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions BDS movement. These acts of defiance reach millions and challenge the normalized idea of Israel as a liberal, inclusive democracy. Instead, they highlight the contradictions and human rights abuses that many believe are ignored or covered up in mainstream discourse. Cultural production has immense power to shape public consciousness, and when artists lend their voices to Palestinian solidarity, they disrupt the sanitized image carefully curated by lobby-funded campaigns. From documentaries to poetry readings to viral TikTok songs, the message is clear: Palestinian narratives are gaining ground. The cultural pushback is amplified by the fact that many of these institutions and individuals are not motivated by politics alone, but by a deep commitment to justice, equality, and human dignity. When academic and cultural spaces begin to echo these values, the result is a loss of legitimacy for those who advocate blind support for Israeli policies. Funding threats, smear campaigns, and accusations of anti-Semitism, once effective tools used to suppress dissent, are now viewed with suspicion. especially when they are weaponized to silence criticism of a state's actions. The resistance coming from universities and cultural spaces is organic, growing, and increasingly immune to intimidation. As these voices multiply and connect globally, they form a network of conscience that challenges the Israel lobby, not just in politics, but in the moral and intellectual arenas where public opinion is truly formed. Corporations and political figures are beginning to feel a unique and growing pressure from a new axis of accountability. Consumers and voters who are deeply informed, socially active, and morally assertive. The traditional playbook of lobbying and campaign financing that once ensured unwavering political support for Israel is facing unexpected resistance. Politicians, particularly in democratic societies, are starting to weigh the cost of their alliances, not just in dollars, but in public sentiment. As awareness of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict spreads through social media and independent journalism, constituents are demanding clarity, transparency, and conscience from their elected leaders. Politicians who once blindly echoed pro-Israel talking points are now met with protests, viral backlash, and even primary challenges from within their own parties. This shift is forcing lawmakers to reconsider their stance or risk losing the support of their base, especially among progressive and younger voters who are more critical of Israeli policies and more vocal in their solidarity with Palestine. Corporate entities, too, are discovering that neutrality or complicity in geopolitical injustices is no longer a viable strategy. Brands that fail to take a stand, or, worse, appear to support one side through business dealings or public statements, can become targets of consumer boycotts and viral criticism. Multinational companies, particularly in sectors like fashion, technology, and food, have come under scrutiny for partnerships, investments, or supply chain ties linked to Israeli firms or government-backed projects. The economic consequences are real, especially in a marketplace where brand loyalty is increasingly tied to ethical alignment. Companies are now being forced to conduct deeper due diligence, not just in terms of legal compliance, but also in terms of reputational risk and moral responsibility. Shareholders and stakeholders are raising questions that cannot be answered with bland statements or PR spin. This change marks a fundamental transformation in how influence operates. It's no longer enough to control legislation or media narratives. Public trust has become the real currency. The Israel lobby, long reliant on behind-the-scenes deals and high-level access, now faces a counterforce that operates in the open, transparent, emotional, and widespread. This force is reshaping the landscape in boardrooms and ballot boxes alike. The pressure is no longer one-sided. It now flows both ways. Corporations and politicians must increasingly weigh their relationship with the Israel lobby against the rising cost of public disapproval. This creates an environment where loyalty to the lobby is no longer safe, but potentially hazardous to careers and corporate survival. The global power structure is undergoing a profound transformation as the world gradually shifts from a unipolar to a multipolar order. For decades, the United States and its Western allies maintained dominant influence over global narratives, trade systems, and geopolitical alliances, which in turn enabled the Israel lobby to operate with unprecedented leverage on the world stage. That influence was not only domestic but international, as U.S. foreign policy shaped how institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and NATO treated the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, the rise of competing global powers, especially China, Russia, and an increasingly unified global South, has begun to rebalance the playing field. These emerging power centers are less inclined to support Israel unconditionally, and in many cases, they actively back Palestinian claims in international forums, not out of ideology, but strategic interest and shared historical grievances against Western double standards. This shift in global alliances is eroding the moral and diplomatic shield that the Israel lobby once enjoyed. No longer can it rely on automatic support from powerful nations to block resolutions, suppress investigations, or silence dissent at the international level. Countries like South Africa, Malaysia, Turkey, and even some in Latin America and Eastern Europe are taking bolder stances against Israel's actions, often framing them in terms of colonialism, apartheid, or ethnic cleansing. Their voices are amplified in multilateral platforms that are increasingly independent of U.S. control. The result is a growing chorus of international condemnation that weakens Israel's standing in global diplomacy and reduces the effectiveness of its lobby's international reach. Meanwhile, economic alliances are also shifting as trade partnerships diversify beyond the traditional Western sphere. Israel's economic ties with new markets become more uncertain, especially in regions where public sentiment heavily favors Palestine. International boycotts and sanctions are now being seriously discussed in regions that were previously passive or neutral. This introduces a level of unpredictability that undermines the lobby's long-term strategy, which depended heavily on stability and predictability within a US-dominated system. The multipolar world introduces new centers of narrative creation and policy direction, and many of these are not aligned with the ideological and historical frameworks that sustained the Israel lobby. This evolving landscape means that influence can no longer be monopolized, and the global conversation is no longer dictated from Washington or Tel Aviv alone. It is being shaped by a multitude of voices and perspectives, many of which see the Israel-Palestine issue through a lens of justice, decolonization, and resistance to Western hegemony. One of the most damaging developments for the Israel lobby has been the increasing global awareness of double standards and human rights violations associated with Israeli policies and military actions. For many years, the lobby was successful in framing Israel as a democratic beacon in a volatile region, often portraying its actions as purely defensive and justified. This framing, combined with well-funded public relations campaigns, created a powerful moral shield that discouraged criticism and labeled dissent as anti-Semitic or unpatriotic. But in today's hyper-connected world, where information spreads faster than ever and images from conflict zones reach millions within seconds, that narrative control has started to erode. Graphic videos from Gaza showing civilian casualties, destroyed hospitals, and injured children tell the story that contradicts official statements and challenges long-held assumptions about who the aggressor really is. People across the world are beginning to ask difficult questions. Why are billions in foreign aid going to a country with advanced military technology while humanitarian crises unfold in Gaza? Why is the international community silent when journalists are targeted or when homes are bulldozed and families displaced? Why do principles like freedom, justice, and human rights apply so selectively in global diplomacy? These questions are not being asked in obscure forums. They are being raised by politicians, educators, students, and activists, and echoed in parliaments, courtrooms, and newsrooms around the world. The Israel lobby is increasingly unable to provide convincing answers because the facts on the ground speak louder than any press release. The erosion of moral legitimacy is particularly damaging because it strikes at the heart of what made the Israel lobby so effective. Influence built on power alone is vulnerable to challenge, but influence built on perceived moral high ground is much harder to dismantle. That high ground is slipping away, and with it, the ability to rally automatic support from institutions that once feared the political consequences of criticism. More individuals are distinguishing between Judaism as a religion and Israel as a state, between legitimate criticism of government actions and hatred toward a people. This nuanced understanding makes it harder for the lobby to weaponize guilt or fear as tools of silence. As this clarity grows, so does the willingness to speak out. From human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to UN bodies and independent investigators, the evidence continues to mount. The result is a widespread re-evaluation of previously accepted narratives, weakening the Israel lobby's credibility and making it increasingly difficult to dismiss opposition as fringe or uninformed. What we are witnessing today is not just a political shift, it is a moral awakening. The Israel lobby, once seen as an unshakable force, is now facing resistance on every front: in politics, on social media, in classrooms, on campuses, in the streets, and across borders. Its dominance is no longer guaranteed, its narrative no longer unquestioned. From the erosion of bipartisan support in the United States to the rise of multipolar global power, from the fearless voices of students and activists to the undeniable footage coming out of Gaza, the tide is turning. The world is no longer willing to accept selective justice or silence in the face of suffering. This isn't just the fall of a lobby, it is the rise of a global conscience. Good luck and thank you message to everyone who dares to speak the truth, who stands for justice, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. You are the reason change is possible. Keep questioning, keep learning, keep pushing. Because history is not made by those who stay silent, it's written by those who stand firm when others tremble.